Today, we are strapping in for a pretty deep and fascinating journey.
We really are. We're going into the very fabric of how we experience reality. Our topic: altered states of consciousness, or as you'll hear us call them, ASCs.
It's just a sprawling, immense field. Truly. If you look at the sources you've shared, they connect everything from these profound spiritual moments.
Right, like in deep meditation.
Exactly. All the way down to the chaos caused by, say, severe alcohol intoxication or even just not sleeping for a few days.
So for our purposes, how are we defining this? We need a starting point.
Okay, so a good working definition for us today is this. An altered state of consciousness is any condition which is significantly, qualitatively different from a normal waking state.
Qualitatively different, that's important.
It's crucial. And another key point, these are almost always temporary, induced changes in your mental status.
That sounds simple enough on the surface. But the very first hurdle your sources flag is, well, it's a massive philosophical one.
It really is.
If we're defining an altered state, we first have to agree on what the normal state is.
And that's where everything kind of breaks down right from the start.
Yeah.
Precisely. The challenge is foundational. We just don't have a general, universally agreed upon, objective definition of a normal state of consciousness.
What would that even be?
I mean, is it the state where you're most productive or where you're most self-aware? Maybe it's just the state you happen to spend the most time in.
And because that's so ambiguous.
Exactly. Because of that ambiguity, all of the early attempts to define ASCs had to rely, really heavily on subjective reports, on what the individual felt was a deviation from their personal baseline.
And that reliance on the subjective, as I'm sure we'll get into, becomes its own rich philosophical and scientific problem later on.
Oh, absolutely.
I find it so interesting that while the big scientific study of ASCs really exploded in the 1960s, the concept itself has been creeping into academic language for more than a century.
That's right. The language of an altered state of consciousness has these deep historical markers in psychology and medicine. You can trace the expression back to as early as 1892.
1892, wow.
Yeah, and it was used back then in relation to hypnosis.
Which is still debated today, isn't it, whether hypnosis really counts?
Oh, there's a vigorous debate over whether hypnosis, which is all about heightened suggestibility and focus, truly qualifies as an ASC in the same way, say, a drug experience does. But then, by 1904, you have Max Malhouse using the term unequivocally.
And what was he talking about?
He was using it for pathological conditions, specifically epilepsy.
So right away, you have the subject framed in two totally different ways. The intentionally induced, like hypnosis.
And the accidentally pathological, like a seizure.
Yeah.
A complete accident of biology.
So when did it become, a mainstream academic thing?
The formal entry into modern widespread academia, moving beyond these niche medical terms, really began in the 1960s. You have Arnold M. Ludwig publishing his defining work in 1966, giving us one of the first really comprehensive taxonomies.
And then Charles Tart.
Then came Charles Tart, starting around 1969, who really pushed the term and the whole field into common academic usage. They essentially laid the necessary groundwork for us to study these states seriously.
It let us move past just pathologizing them, right? Which was the dominant trend for a long time.
For a very long time, yes. That early behaviorist and Freudian view often just dismissed anything that wasn't rational wakefulness as, a neurosis, intoxication, or something even more sinister.
There just wasn't room for the idea that these states could actually be beneficial.
Exactly. It took that revival of introspection and humanistic psychology in the mid-20th century with figures like Abraham Maslow and later Walter Pahnke and Tart to re-examine what were sometimes called peak experiences.
They started focusing on the good stuff.
They did. They looked at the potential for ASCs to promote creativity, to resolve trauma, or, as we're seeing in a huge way today, to treat conditions like addiction and depression.
Okay, so let's unpack all this. Our mission for this deep dive is pretty comprehensive. We're going to explore the incredibly diverse ways these states are accessed, from accidental trauma to intentional meditation.
It's an amazing spectrum.
And then we're going to dive deep into the modern scientific attempt to measure and understand the most profound subjective shifts, specifically around the current renaissance in psychedelic research. It's a massive task, but I think the sources give us a good map. So let's start with those foundational definitions from the 60s, because they really had to invent a language to describe this qualitative shift in experience that didn't just boil down to pathology.
And Ludwig's 1966 definition is the essential starting point there. He proposed that an ASC is any mental state induced by, physiological, psychological, or pharmacological agents.
But the critical part, the real innovation, was how it's recognized.
That's it. The critical part is that it must be recognized subjectively by the individual. It's their personal assessment.
They have to feel like it's a sufficient deviation, I think was his term.
A sufficient deviation from their own general norms during alert waking consciousness. That's the core of it.
So the state is completely relative to the individual. My normal is my baseline, and a deviation is measured against me, not against some universal standard of normalcy.
Precisely. And Charles Tart built right on top of this, really emphasizing that subjective perception of the shift.
How did he phrase it?
He defined ASCs as alternate patterns or configurations of experience that differ qualitatively from the baseline state.
A pattern, a whole new configuration.
Yes. He gave this simple example that your ordinary waking state is qualitatively distinct from dreaming or from being under the influence of a significant amount of alcohol. It's a total reorganization, not just a dilution of your normal state.
It's not just that I'm a bit tired or a bit distracted. It's that the entire framework, the very pattern of how my reality processing works, has reconfigured itself.
And this focus on reorganization and complexity, it naturally led to more rigorous demands for how we classify these things.
This is where Farthing comes in 92.
Yes. Farthing added two really practical requirements that are still central to research today. First, he said the change has to be temporary or at least reversible.
Why was that so important?
Well, it's necessary to differentiate it from chronic long-term conditions, things like schizophrenia or severe persistent personality disorders. Those aren't temporary ASCs, they're baseline pathological states.
Okay, that makes sense. And his second requirement, that really drives home the sheer complexity of consciousness.
It really does. He emphasized that for a state to truly qualify as an ASC, multiple dimensions of your subjective experience have to be altered at the same time.
He listed a bunch of them, didn't he?
He listed 14 dimensions, and it's worth naming a few just to get the scope. Things like alterations in your sense of time.
Time moving super fast or slowing to a crawl.
Right. Alterations in emotional control, big changes in your thought processes, from hyperlogical to completely irrational, and, most famously, that feeling of profound unity or boundary loss.
The sense of oceanic boundlessness.
That's the one.
That helps so much. It confirms that a profound ASC isn't just one dial turned up or down on a console. It's the entire mixing board of your experience being shifted at once.
Which brings us right up to the modern neuroscientific research perspective. A researcher named Schmidt in 2016 refined a working definition designed specifically for empirical studies, for lab work.
And it keeps those key requirements.
It does. It preserves them. The state has to diverge significantly from your normal everyday fluctuations. It has to feel genuinely different.
And it has to be short.
Second, yes, it must be a short duration, typically minutes to hours. Again, that's to clearly separate it from chronic pathology.
And the most important takeaway from Schmidt's research is that it keeps that multidimensional focus. It's not just one thing changing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The modern research definition stresses that an ASC is a multidimensional phenomenon.
Right.
It is not just a simple quantitative change in a single function like, your heart rate going up a bit or feeling a little more alert.
It's a whole pattern.
It's a specific phenomenological pattern that results from a combination of many independent consciousness factors. This is why psychological scaling tools, questionnaires, are so essential. They let scientists actually quantify these many factors against a clean, normal baseline.
Okay, so to give you, the listener, a kind of comprehensive map of how diverse these induction methods are, we should look at the classification based on how the state is actually induced.
Dieter Wedel's classification scheme is brilliant for this. It's still widely used because it organizes this immense variety into 5 understandable categories.
Let's walk through them. First up is pathological.
Right. This covers internal illnesses, epilepsy, brain damage, the delirium you get from a high fever. These are involuntary and, well, usually pretty detrimental.
Okay, number 2 is pretty obvious. Pharmacological.
Yes, induced by psychoactive substances. And this ranges from the everyday, like caffeine and alcohol, all the way to LSD and MDMA.
Third is physical-physiological.
This one results from bodily actions or conditions. So think fasting, intense physical endurance, being in a sensory isolation tank, or even sexual activity.
Number 4 is psychological. So using the mind itself.
Exactly. Induced by mental techniques. This is where music, deep concentration, meditation, hypnosis, or repetitive chanting would fall.
And the last one is maybe the most mysterious. Spontaneous.
Right. These are states that just seem to happen without any clear external or internal trigger. Daydreaming, moments of intense creativity, or a near-death experience would be prime examples.
That scope is just incredible. It confirms that the altered state of consciousness is a truly unifying and maybe unavoidable part of the human experience. It touches everything.
It really does. Intentionality, accident, pathology, deprivation, it's all
Yeah.
in there.
And I remember reading that beyond just classifying by how you get there, some researchers tried to classify them by the type of experience.
That's right. Roland Fisher, for instance, suggested classifying them along what he called ergotropic or trophotropic properties.
Okay, let's pause. We need to define those technical terms.
Absolutely. So ergotropic states are all about high arousal, high energy output, excitement. Think ecstasy, being in the zone during peak athletic performance, or even hallucinatory psychosis.
High energy. Got it. So trophotropic is the opposite.
It's the opposite. Trophotropic states involve reduced arousal and increased integration or rest. This is your deep meditation, sensory deprivation, or deep trance states. It's a classification based on where the energy is going, out or in.
And one last researcher, Adolf Dittrich, found that despite all these different ways to get to an ASC, there are 3 common dimensions that just keep popping up.
Yes, through empirical study of subjective reports, he found these 3 core dimensions that emerge regardless of the induction method.
Which are?
First, that oceanic boundlessness we mentioned, feelings of unity, ecstasy, dissolution of boundaries. Second, the flip side, dread of ego dissolution, paranoia, fear, a total loss of control.
And the third?
Visionary restructuralization. This is the intense hallucinations, seeing new perceptual patterns, synesthesia, your senses getting cross-wired. These are the qualitative hallmarks we now try to measure objectively.
Oceanic boundlessness and dread of ego dissolution. I mean, those are some of the most profound, emotionally charged terms in this whole field. They perfectly pivot us to our next section, which is all about the actual mechanisms behind this alteration, starting with neurochemistry.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because now we're moving from what the experience feels like to how the body and brain actually trigger these massive shifts. We're exploring that whole variety of triggers, from ancient spiritual practices to modern drugs and just sheer accidents.
Let's focus on the pharmacological routes first. They give us the clearest window into how a targeted neurochemical disruption can work.
So psychoactive drugs, by definition, have to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Exactly. They have to get past that protective barrier to disturb specific brain functions, and that's what causes these predictable changes in your awareness, your attitude, and your behavior. And the specifics of that disturbance, the where and the how of the drug's action, that's what dictates the specific type of ASC you get.
Take LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, as a prime example of a very targeted yet incredibly profound disruption.
Okay, so how does it work?
LSD is what's known as a serotonin receptor agonist. In simple terms, it acts by activating serotonin receptors, specifically a subtype called 5-HT2A.
And where in the brain is this happening?
Its effects are most prominent in the cerebral cortex. That's the thin outer layer involved in all our higher order thought, our attitude, our insight.
So what does that activation actually do to how we process reality?
Well, when that 5-HT2A receptor is activated, especially in the deep layers of the cortex, it basically disrupts the normal hierarchical communication pathways in the brain.
What do you mean by hierarchical?
Think of your brain's internal network as a really well-regulated, centralized corporate structure. Information flows very strictly from the bottom up. LSD, in essence, decentralizes that entire corporate structure.
It flattens the org chart.
It completely flattens it. It allows communication between brain areas that don't normally talk to each other. And this is what leads to those intense sensory and cognitive effects, from fear to ecstasy. And it's the key neurochemical correlate to what researchers call ego death, or ego dissolution.
So that temporary vanishing of your sense of self is literally the result of the brain's normal filtering and prioritizing systems just temporarily going offline.
Precisely. Now compare that very targeted action to something like alcohol, which involves a much broader, more fundamental alteration of the brain's most basic functional mechanism.
The balance between go and stop.
The inhibitory and excitatory balance, exactly.
So how does alcohol create that generalized physiological slowdown that we all associate with being drunk?
Alcohol acts on 2 major classes of neurotransmitters. First, it increases the effect of GABA, which is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the master brake.
So it's pushing the brake pedal.
It's enhancing GABA's activity, which results in slower actions, slower communication, slower processing across your whole central nervous system. But at the same time, it's also decreasing the activity of the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate.
Which is the brain's accelerator.
It's the primary accelerator, so alcohol is essentially hitting the brake while simultaneously taking its foot off the gas.
That's a perfect analogy.
The net effect is just a profound, generalized physiological slowdown and suppression of brain function. And of course, as a side effect of all this complex neurochemistry, you get an increase in the pleasure chemical dopamine.
Which is a big part of why it's so rewarding and highly addictive.
A very significant part.
Okay, so we've covered a profound reorganization with LSD and a generalized suppression with alcohol. What about a pure stimulant like cocaine? How does that create its specific high arousal ASC?
Cocaine works differently again. It alters consciousness by interfering with neurotransmitter reuptake in the synapse.
Okay, break that down.
So neurons communicate by releasing these signaling chemicals, neurotransmitters, into the little gap between them, the synapse. And usually, the transmitting neuron very quickly reuptakes the excess, cleans it up.
And cocaine stops that cleanup process.
It inhibits the cleanup process,
Yeah.
particularly for key chemicals like norepinephrine, serotonin, and most importantly, dopamine.
So it's like leaving the tap running and blocking the drain at the same time.
That's exactly it. By blocking the reabsorption of these chemicals, it leaves a much higher concentration of them in the synapse, where they just continuously stimulate the receiving neuron. This flood is what results in the high energy, the euphoria, and that altered state we call a high.
And then you have substances like MDMA, which is being used clinically a lot now, and it's known for a very specific kind of emotional shift.
MDMA acts on a combination of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, but its defining feature is a massive release of serotonin. This leads to elevated positive feelings and a stark reduction in negative feelings.
Which is why it's called an empathogen.
Precisely. It frequently results in sensations of intimacy, empathy, and social connection, a unique ASC that's focused almost entirely on our affective or emotional communication.
Okay, let's pivot away now from intentional pharmacological use to accidental or pathological causes. This really shows just how fragile our normal waking state truly is.
It is remarkably fragile, and Jeffrey Avner, a professor of clinical pediatrics, suggested back in 2006 that many pathological causes of ASCs share a common thread.
What's that?
They often begin with reduced self-awareness, which is then followed by a reduced awareness of the external environment.
But right away, that observation seems to run into some friction, even within the sources you shared.
It does, which really highlights the difficulty of objectifying the subjective. You have people with lived experience of conditions like depersonalization, derealization disorder, who often report the complete opposite.
They say they feel more aware.
Exactly. That their altered state is characterized by an increased and terrifyingly detached awareness of both themselves and their environment, not a reduction. They feel hyper-aware, but totally disconnected.
How can research possibly reconcile two such fundamentally opposite subjective reports? Reduced awareness on one hand and increased detached awareness on the other.
It forces us to realize that self-awareness isn't a single on-off switch. It's multifaceted. The objective metric, say an fMRI, might reveal a reduction in executive function, your ability to act on your self-awareness.
While the person is subjectively reporting an increase in their observational awareness.
Exactly. The underlying mechanism might be the same, a disruption in typical frontal parietal network activity, but the experience is interpreted differently based on the exact nature of that network compromise.
Let's move to a pure physical mechanism, blunt force trauma. How does a physical blow to the head cause a temporary ASC?
Well, a concussion, for instance, causes an ASC because the external impact physically disrupts blood flow and neural communication. A crucial immediate effect is the diversion of blood flow away from the prefrontal cortex, the PFC,
The command center.
the command center, the area responsible for your analytical thought, executive decision-making, social filtering, and self-monitoring.
So when the PFC's function is impaired, what behavioral changes do we see?
You see very specific, predictable changes. Impaired self-awareness, loss of impulse control, difficulty with complex problem solving, and a generalized sense of confusion or fogginess. The brain prioritizes survival over high-level analytical thought, temporarily suspending the constraints of our usual consciousness.
And epilepsy provides a clear example of a recurrent internal neurological trigger.
Epilepsy is a disorder defined by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. During a seizure, the patient experiences a temporary ASC, often involving intense hallucinations, temporary dissociation from reality, and a loss of mental control.
And we can see this on a brain scan.
We can. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI studies, have actually detected the specific localized brain activity underlying these hallucinations while a seizure is happening. It gives us a strong neurological basis for this temporary pathological dissociation.
And beyond direct damage or an electrical storm, many common ASCs just result from deprivation, from a lack of things we take for granted.
That's right. Oxygen deficiency, or hypoxia, directly and rapidly impacts brain function, leading almost immediately to confusion and an altered state. Infections, like viral meningitis, cause the coverings of the brain to swell.
And the fever and inflammation push you into an altered state.
Yes, and sometimes seizures. It's a cascade.
And then there's the most ubiquitous deprivation we all experience, lack of sleep.
Sleep deprivation can be severe enough to induce symptoms that mimic psychosis, including hallucinations. It's also a well-documented seizure provocation factor. A 2007 MRI study from Harvard Medical School provided a fascinating insight here.
What did they find?
They found that a sleep-deprived brain was demonstrably incapable of controlling its sensoromotor functions, leading to reduced physical coordination and impaired self-awareness.
So it links the simple act of being tired to a measurable loss of functional capacity in the brain.
And that's what qualifies it as an ASC.
And finally, a mechanism that bridges both the psychological and the physiological, extended fasting.
Extended fasting, whether it's deliberate for religious purposes or pathological because of a condition like anorexia, pushes the body into a severe metabolic state. The resulting neurochemical and hormonal shifts cause temporary dissociation from reality as the body just tries to cope with extreme stress.
So in all these cases, whether self-awareness is reduced or hyper-aware, they all compromise the reliable, rational functioning of your usual baseline state.
So we've established this enormous scope of ASCs, but now we really have to narrow our focus. We need to look at the state that has captured the most clinical and philosophical attention today.
The psychedelic state.
The psychedelic state, which reliably produces experiences that are often described as mystical.
And this state is central to all the current research for depression, for addiction, for anxiety.
Primarily because the intensity of that mystical type experience is consistently shown to predict lasting therapeutic effects. The more profound the experience, the better the outcome.
What's fascinating here is that the psychedelic journey itself, despite its reputation for chaos, is actually highly structured. Researchers like McGovern have used thematic analysis to partition the experience in time.
Absolutely. The experience is best understood as a process in 3 phases: before, during, and after. The first phase is the before, or what they call preparation set.
This is your mindset going in.
It's all about your subjective intentions, your mental readiness, even the use of experiential aids. If you go in anxious or unwilling, the outcome is often negative. It's that simple.
Then you have the acute phase, during.
This is the high-intensity part, defined by those sensory and cognitive distortions, the hallucinations, the synesthesia, the loss of time.
And this is where the setting part comes in.
Crucially, the outcome here is heavily affected by your immediate mindset and the environmental stability, the setting. But the sensory disturbances in this phase, they aren't just noise. They're often seen as conduits for later insight.
They feel meaningful.
They're attributed high epistemic value, which is a scientific way of saying they feel like undeniable truth or knowledge.
And finally, you have the experiential impact after. This is where the ASC translates into real-world, durable change.
The impact phase is what researchers are most interested in clinically. It's often characterized as eudaimonic.
We should clarify that term.
Yes. It doesn't just mean happy. It means human flourishing, or a sense of deep well-being that's rooted in purpose. Users report achieving a sense of nirvana or resolving really difficult emotional conflicts.
And this growth comes from
What?
Sudden insights.
It comes from these sudden revelations or insights, like realizing the absurdity of many of the societal patterns we impose upon each other, or recognizing that one's life has been an ongoing pursuit of meaningless chemical fixations. The therapeutic growth comes from letting go of those unhelpful attachments.
It's clear that humans have been seeking these kinds of revelatory states forever. I mean, we're talking about utilization that could stretch back 30,000 years, using everything from plants to ritualistic dancing.
And its historical significance is massive. Some theorists, famously Terence McKenna, even suggested that the regular use of psychedelic mushrooms in prehistoric times was the catalyst that led to the development of complex human language and symbol use.
That's a huge claim.
It's a huge claim, but there's also compelling historical evidence suggesting mind-altering substances may have been instrumental in the formation of some of the world's main religions, where their early use was often aimed at inducing prophecy, healing, and inner strength.
This blending of the chemical, the spiritual, and the psychological is just perfectly captured by Aldous Huxley's seminal 1954 book, The Doors of Perception. It really defined the modern conversation.
Huxley's work is the blueprint for how we define the modern psychedelic mystical experience. His fundamental motivation for taking mescaline was based on this philosophical idea that the brain acts as a kind of limiting filter.
A reducing valve.
A reducing valve, that's his term. It restricts the totality of what he called the mind at large. So we only see this narrow sliver of reality just so we can survive and, perform basic functions.
And his experience was a profound, almost hyper-real qualitative shift.
He described how his perception of ordinary objects gained this intense, almost sacramental quality, which he called isness, or Istigkeit.
A term he borrowed from the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart.
Yes, he felt he accessed and understood concepts like the Hindu Satchitananda being consciousness bliss, and experienced a profound not-I state, where the distinct boundaries of his self just dissolved.
So what was his conclusion? Was it a religious experience for him?
He concluded the mescaline experience was neither a divine illumination nor a full beatific vision, but what Thomas Aquinas called a gratuitous grace, a free gift, unearned by moral effort.
And he saw it as particularly useful for the intellectual, who he famously described as a victim of words and symbols. It let them access direct perception instead of just abstract reasoning.
However, this leads us directly to the core philosophical friction in the whole field. Huxley was what is known as a perennialist.
Meaning he believed all religions point to the same universal truth.
Exactly. This worldview holds that all major spiritual traditions share a single, universal underlying truth or mystical experience. And because he believed the psychedelic experience was universal and unmediated by culture, he assumed it cut across all cultural divides.
And that assumption then got baked into the science.
It's exactly what shaped the psychometric tools we still use today, like the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, the MEQ, which attempts to quantify these presumed universal traits.
Okay, here's where the philosophical and cultural critique comes in, questioning whether mysticism is truly a universal concept at all, or if it's deeply culturally loaded, which could potentially undermine the entire research framework.
The critique is powerful, and it's gaining a lot of traction. It argues that the concept of mysticism used in psychedelic science fails to acknowledge its deep historical roots in modern Christian notions of beatific vision and union with God.
So because Western universities were built on Christian worldviews,
that became the established paradigm. It was the lens through which scholars understood all other behaviors they deemed religious, and they unconsciously perpetuated a bias, limiting cross-cultural sensitivity.
So when researchers today use the term mystical experience, even if they think they're being secular, they're actually importing centuries of Christian-centric baggage. They're potentially forcing the square peg of, say, an indigenous Amazonian experience into the round hole of Western theology.
That is the core of the problem. If your questionnaire is implicitly biased towards a specific form of spiritual experience, it may misinterpret or completely fail to capture the reality of a non-Western subject.
And this skepticism isn't new.
Not at all. It was voiced very strongly by critics like Robert Charles Zahner, an Oxford professor of Eastern religions. He argued that drug-induced states were simply not the same thing as the Christian beatific vision.
Zahner's argument was basically, your interpretation is fundamentally biased by your background, by your set.
Precisely. Zahner's most famous critique came after he took mescaline himself and described his own experience as, and this is a quote, farcical meaninglessness, not profound or religious.
Wow.
This led him to stress that his subject's existing set Huxley's deep familiarity with Vedantic and Buddhist concepts biased his interpretation toward finding profound spiritual meaning. Zahner warned that personality, preparation, and environment, the set and setting all, fundamentally shape the cognitive content and interpretation of the ASC.
And then you have the critique from the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, which was less about the content of the experience and more about the ethics of even seeking it.
Buber's issue was existential. He viewed the drug experience as a fugitive flight into a strictly private sphere, a kind of spiritual isolation.
A holiday from reality.
He called it a holiday from the necessity to verify oneself as a person participating in the community of logos and cosmos, the real world of shared experience and responsibility.
So for him, real growth means facing your real-world situation, not escaping it.
Exactly. He found the drug experience a flight into situationlessness, which he felt was fundamentally illegitimate for spiritual growth.
It's just astounding that even Huxley, the man who wrote the book that popularized this for a generation, later admitted his most famous trip was partial and imperfect. That's a huge self-correction.
It's the ultimate self-correction. In 1955, Huxley had another, more profound mescaline experience, and he later wrote that his initial trip, the one indoors, was merely a temptation to escape into false, or at least imperfect, and partial nirvanas of beauty and mere knowledge.
So what did he find in the second trip?
His later experience, he wrote, led him to the direct, total awareness, from the inside, so to say, of love as the primary and fundamental cosmic fact.
That post-Huxley revision reveals the central tension here. Even the most profound subjective state isn't static. It can evolve, deepen, or be reinterpreted. And this forces science to find ways to decompose and measure these shifts objectively, to move past loaded terms like mysticism and seek more secular, universally applicable constructs. Okay, so we now shift our focus to the modern scientific effort to decompose these incredibly complex subjective states into objective, measurable components. And this move is essential because, as we've seen, relying solely on the culturally loaded term mysticism just introduces too much ambiguity into clinical trials.
We need robust neurobiological frameworks that can explain how the brain generates these alternate patterns of consciousness. One major theory that's really dominating the discussion, especially in psychedelic neuroscience, is the entropic brain hypothesis, or EBH.
That name sounds dense, but the concept is actually quite elegant. It's a contrast between two fundamental types of consciousness.
It is elegant. It uses a concept from physics entropy, which is a measure of disorder, to describe the brain state. The hypothesis contrasts primary consciousness with secondary consciousness.
Okay, what's primary consciousness?
Primary consciousness is characterized by high entropy. That means more unconstrained cognition and less ordered, more random neurodynamics.
So high entropy is messy, flexible, and unconstrained.
Exactly. Think of your normal brain, your secondary consciousness, which is low entropy, as a highly regulated highway system. Traffic or information flows only along designated routes, quickly and efficiently governed by strict rules.
And the psychedelic state.
The psychedelic state, or primary consciousness high entropy, is like temporarily turning off all the traffic lights and road signs. Information starts flowing freely between every back road and major artery, creating this temporary, complex, but messy web of unconstrained paths.
And we see this high entropy state elsewhere, not just with psychedelics.
We do. We see it in infancy, in REM sleep, at the onset of psychosis, and in the psychedelic state.
So psychedelics temporarily return the adult brain to this more flexible, unconstrained state, allowing for novel connections and insights to form precisely because the normal constraints, Huxley's reducing valve, are temporarily lifted.
That's the key insight. Secondary consciousness, in contrast, is our normal waking state. Low entropy, constrained cognition, highly efficient for executive functions, but very rigid. The EBH suggests psychedelics offer a vital, measurable window into consciousness by temporarily reverting the brain to this more flexible, higher entropy state.
To bring rigor to this, scientists have to break down that monolithic mystical experience into distinct secular and measurable constructs.
And the psychological construct that's gained the most traction as a more secular, measurable replacement for the mystical concept is ego dissolution.
Focusing just on the loss of self.
It focuses specifically on the loss of the sense of self. And researchers have successfully created and validated measurement tools like the Ego Dissolution Inventory, or EDI.
And that lets you put a number on it.
It allows for the objective quantification of this subjective change. And that lets you link the neurological mechanisms, like the 5-HT2A activation, directly to a measurable outcome, the score on the EDI.
And we also have the proposal from Gurn and Christoph for a self-experience taxonomy. How does that help refine our measurement even further?
Their suggestion is to break down the psychedelic alterations of self-experience into two discrete categories: the politically self-experience and the mental self-experience.
This sounds like a really pragmatic approach.
It's highly pragmatic. So instead of asking a patient if they achieved nirvana, you ask, did you feel disconnected from your physical body? That's a bodily self-experience alteration. Or, did you feel like your memory or your beliefs about yourself were dissolving? That's a mental self-experience alteration.
By using this kind of taxonomy, you can ask much more fine-grained questions and get results that are directly comparable to existing research in cognitive neuroscience.
Exactly. It moves these complex phenomena out of the black box of culturally loaded mysticism and into the realm of empirically supported constructs. It allows researchers to situate these effects within the established landscape of neuroscience and psychology, focusing on mechanisms rather than interpretations.
This whole discussion, how we define a feeling, how we measure a subjective experience objectively, it really brings us to the core philosophical tension that underpins this whole deep dive.
It does.
The distinction between subjectivity and objectivity.
This distinction is just crucial for any learner engaging with science. Subjectivity is anything that is dependent on minds. These are things like your biases, your personal perceptions, your opinions, your conscious experiences.
So if a claim is only true from one person's point of view,
it's subjectively true. For instance, whether a dose of a drug is too intense or just right is purely subjective. It depends entirely on your mind.
and then you have objectivity.
Objectivity is confirmed or assumed to be independent of any minds. This is verifiable truth. The statement that LSD activates the 5-HT2A receptor is an objective claim. It's true regardless of who is observing it. Objectivity requires defining truth based on propositions with verifiable evidence, independent of personal perception.
We can see this tension historically by contrasting two giants of Western thought, Descartes and Newton.
René Descartes famously used a method of intense personal deduction, resulting in his ultimate subjective realization. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
His whole philosophy relied on that subjective act of thinking as the irrefutable starting point for all truth. He started internal and worked his way out.
He did. And Isaac Newton, on the other hand, the natural philosopher, applied the relatively objective scientific method. He looked for evidence and verifiable facts before forming a hypothesis. He wanted to define universal external laws. He started external and sought verification.
This tension dictates how we have to approach ASC research today. Do we prioritize the undeniable subjective reality that the person felt unified with the cosmos, or do we prioritize the objective neurological facts that their prefrontal cortex was temporarily compromised?
And modern science is forced to try and bridge those two pillars. It has to.
And this philosophical framework has profound social relevance way beyond the lab. It gives us a powerful tool to understand why subjective experience has to be validated. Let's look at the example from historiography provided by the anthropologist Michel Rolf-Toyot.
A perfect analogy for ASCs.
He developed the concepts of historicity 1 and historicity 2.
Right, so H1 or historicity 1 is the factual materiality of the past. It's the objective truth of what actually happened. H2 or historicity 2 is the collection of subjectivities.
The stories we tell about what happened.
The narratives, the interpretations, the histories that we stitch together to try and grasp the past. And Trio emphasized that history-making is never purely objective. It involves power dynamics, where certain subjective voices, certain H2s are amplified while others are silenced.
So, if the ASC experience is H1, the objective neurological fact of altered brain chemistry, then the patient's subjective narrative of I realize the absurdity of my life's patterns is H2.
Precisely. And by prioritizing and validating H2, the subjective narrative, we unlock the therapeutic insight. Trio's major point was that thinking of current historical narratives as impartial, objective depictions risks sealing historical understanding and silencing the marginalized.
But if we acknowledge that the history, or in our case, the experience, is never purely objective,
we create space for previously silenced or dismissed voices, the subjective reports, to be appreciated for their unique insight into reality.
So the same logic applies directly to the clinical setting. The subjective report, the internal narrative, is a valid, irreplaceable insight into a unique reality. Ignoring that subjective truth means ignoring the very mechanism of healing.
We have to use objective tools to measure H1, the change in brain entropy, the receptor activity, but the therapeutic efficacy seems to hinge entirely on the quality of H2, the subject's narrative, and how they integrate the insight. #HelpedUTRO.
So what does this all mean? Our deep dive has shown that altered states of consciousness are far from monolithic. I mean, they're induced by everything from targeted neurotransmitter disruption to just not getting enough sleep to trauma to profound spiritual intention.
And their profound nature is really forcing science to re-examine the limits of its own objective methods, particularly in how we even define the human self.
The fundamental tension remains the defining challenge of the whole field. How do you use objective universal tools like the Ego Dissolution inventory or an fMRI machine measuring entropy to quantify and leverage these profoundly unique, subjective, and often culturally loaded experiences like the mystical state?
It's a clash. The necessity of empirical evidence clashes directly with the richness of the personal journey.
But the reason this matters so much right now, the reason for all this research, is the therapeutic application. We are seeing objective clinical success in treating addiction and depression using these substances.
Absolutely. We know empirically that in modern clinical trials, the intensity of the subjective mystical experience, as measured by our best psychometric tools, predicts the lasting positive therapeutic effects.
So the objective therapeutic benefit, the lower depression score, the fact that someone stops smoking for good, seems to be mediated entirely by the profound subjective insight they gained.
It really does.
You brought up Huxley's later, more profound experience, that realization of love as the primary cosmic fact, which he felt was the central reality, not just some side effect of seeing pretty colors.
That realization leads us to the key paradox, and our final thought for you to take away. If the desired, objectively measured outcome, the clinical success, the enduring human flourishing, or eudaimonia, is predicated upon the subject gaining an irrefutable, completely internal, deeply subjective insight, like that realization of unity or love as the central cosmic fact. Does the true long-term value of the experience ultimately lie in its irrefutable subjectivity, even if we have to rely on objective tools to measure its aftershocks?
Does H2, the subjective narrative, become more important than H1, the neurological mechanism?
That is something for you to mull or explore on your own.
An outstanding deep dive into the science and the philosophy of the human mind unbound. Thank you for guiding us.